So now we're going to have an economist's view. This comes to us from Thomas Pugh. He is ex-UK Treasurer. He did some very important work for them before moving on to capital economics. And his specialism is analysing trends. He's often quoted on television and in the press, and so we're very lucky to have him here. Please welcome Thomas Pugh.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Right, two bits of admin first, I think. I'm very happy to send slides out to anyone that wants them to save you taking blurry pictures, and I'm sure to save my eyes from the thousands of camera flashes that will be occurring. The second bit of admin is really, I tried very hard on the title, and it's probably the best pun that you'll get out of me this morning, so I hope you all appreciate it. So what I'm going to do this morning is really just take you through where we see some of the key kind of macroeconomic variables, where we see the UK economy going over the next year or so, with a big focus really on consumer spending, consumer demand, that kind of thing. So, if I crack on to my first slide, I'm sure you all saw yesterday a really chunky fall in inflation. Unambiguously good news, really. It was driven by a really big fall in energy prices. Oh, sorry, energy price inflation, anyway. Remember, when we're talking about inflation, we're talking about annual growth in prices. So what happened was, remember that massive rise in energy prices that we had kind of this time last year? Well, that essentially fell out of the annual comparison. So you get a very big drop in the rate of growth. That doesn't mean the prices are falling. I see that misunderstanding quite a lot. It just means prices are going up at a slower rate. But as you can kind of see on this chart, inflation will probably hover around its current level for the rest of this year, take another big step down in kind of spring next year, and then it'll hover around 2.5% for probably most of the year. I might regret saying this, but we can be reasonably confident about that for a couple of reasons, and the big one is stuff like this. So you can do this kind of thing with lots of commodity prices, lots of different types of inflation. I've picked food, agricultural commodity prices and food for obvious reasons here. But what we've seen is big drops in kind of headline commodity prices. So food prices, for example, have fallen right back to kind of where they were. So that means that when we follow that through, what does that mean for food prices, food price inflation? We can see that it's going to fall over the next couple of months, 6 months or so. So what we do here is just divide inflation into two buckets. So you've got goods, which is all the stuff you buy in shops, clothes, food, etc., etc. Services, what everyone in here provides, go for a haircut, cinema, etc., etc. So we can be pretty confident as you can be with forecasting in economics, that goods price inflation is going to fall very sharply over the next 6 months to a year. That'll help drag down that headline inflation. The trickier part is services. So that's the green line there. That's trickier to forecast because you don't have the big falls kind of in commodity prices that you can use. It's much more related to what's going on in the domestic economy, particularly the labour market. So that tightness in the labour market that we've seen, high wage growth, is helping to keep that services number elevated. Now, it will come down, but it will come down much more slowly than goods price inflation. And if there's going to be kind of an upset, that's where it's going to be, really. So, talking about the labour market. Now, I don't know if this has kind of made it out of the economic statistics world yet, but there's a bit of a a drama, or at least what passes for drama going on here. Basically, the way the ONS comes up with these statistics on the unemployment rate and how many people are employed and all that kind of stuff is they ring up a lot of people across the economy, ask them if they're employed, unemployed, if they're not working, why aren't they working? The problem is the ONS has found that the only people that answer the phone to a random number during a weekday tend to be unemployed or retired, and therefore that has skewed their sampling quite a lot. So until next year, when they completely revamp it all of these kind of statistics come with a little bit of a health warning. But there are still kind of three key messages that I want to talk about on this chart. The first is that the labour market has turned a corner. You can see on this chart, so we've got vacancies which are falling, the unemployment rate is rising, so it's clearly turned a corner. It's still tight by kind of historical standards, especially an unemployment rate of 4.2, given we've had barely any economic growth for 4 years, would be classed as still a pretty tight labour market by historical standards. Second point is, it's going to ease further. We're seeing more people coming back into the labour market. We are seeing hiring starting to falter a little bit. So that unemployment rate is going to rise. That vacancy number will come down. But it's not going to rise to loads. We've got an unemployment rate of about 5% by the end of next year. So yes, a continued loosening, but not huge by really any stretch of the imagination. And that really brings me on to kind of the third point, which is when we look at what's the big picture over the next 2, 5, 10 years, actually labour is probably going to be a much more scarce and precious resource than it has been over the previous 10 years. The reason the labour market is so tight is because we've lost almost 2% of our workforce to sickness. Once you go out of the labour market to sickness, history shows you don't tend to come back in. So very unlikely we're going to see a surge in the numbers of people coming back to work over the next couple of years. Further out, the demographic challenges that the UK, not just the UK, the whole of Western Europe, China, Australia, etc., are all facing, means workforce is going to grow by half what it did over the last 10, 20 years. So when we're planning ahead for kind of growth, workforce problems, I mean, it's really going to be looking at how you recruit. It's going to be much tougher to recruit people, how you retain people, because people are going to be much more valuable, and really how do you replace people, automation, AI, all of this kind of thing. So they're the key messages here. But regardless of kind of why the labour market is tight, the result is an extremely strong rate of pay. So that blue line is what we call nominal pay growth, and that is literally just the increase in your pay packet on an annual basis. A couple of things to point out here, I think. So obviously, pay growth at 8% is tough if you're a business paying that. To put it into context, the Bank of England thinks that pay growth of between 3 and 3.5% is consistent with 2% inflation. So pay growth at 8% makes them very nervous, and that's why I think it was a bit of a surprise that they kept interest rates on hold a couple of months ago, but that's where we are. As the labour market eases, we just talked about, as inflation comes down pretty sharply, as we've already seen and will continue to see, that pay growth number will fall. It will come down. This is more of a stylized example. It will, of course, be much more bumpy than that. But we expect pay growth to fall reasonably quickly over the next year or so. But it won't fall as quickly as inflation. So that means your real earnings, which is kind of a good measure of the amount of stuff that you can buy for your kind of pay packet, are going to increase. So we've been through this horrible cost of living crisis where real earnings were severely negative. That's now ended, and real wages will continue to grow over the next, at least out till the end of 2020, 24 and probably continue to rise after that. So that's a positive then for consumer spending. So this is where I think it probably gets more interesting for everyone here. What we like to talk about when we talk about consumer spending and is what we call real household disposable income. So that's a measure of just basically how much money, how much resources households have got to be able to go out and spend. That's that blue line there. You can see it rises reasonably well. But we've also got consumer spending on this chart. That's consumer spending on absolutely everything in the economy. It's the green line here. Normally, those two lines trend quite nicely together. You get more money, you spend a bit more. We've got this, this wedge between those lines. So as consumer income improves, not all of that is going to go directly into consumer spending. And that's for a couple of reasons. Obviously, the first is that we've had this massive rise in interest rates. Now, this chart just shows you where financial markets expect or expected interest rates to go on those dates. So financial markets, yeah, interest rates have peaked. That's great. The impact on the economy hasn't peaked yet, though. There's still more than 1.5 million people who are going to remortgage next year. They're going to go from paying 2% to 6%, even if the base rate stays where it is. So that's going to be a big drag on incomes. Not as big as you think, maybe, because 40% of people actually don't have a mortgage. They've paid it off already. And another 30% of people rent. So it's not as big a drag as it first seems. But those people who don't have a mortgage tend to have large savings. They're getting more income from those savings, but actually they're just saving more. They're not really going out and spending that additional income. So interest rates, even if they remain where they are, even if they start to come down towards the end of next year, as seems likely, it's still going to be a pretty significant drag on consumer spending. The other impact is consumer confidence. And this is a bit trickier to kind of forecast because it's not, you're not using nice, hard financial market data. You're talking about people's feelings and confidence. So I think there's a couple of things to point out here. This chart is looking at accommodation, output in the accommodation and food services industry. So essentially it's the number of meals served, the number of hotel rooms booked, this kind of thing. And it's been, okay, it's not grown by loads, but it's been really stable. I think going back to certainly when I was at university studying economics, if we had a cost of living crisis or a recession or anything like that, the first thing that people do is stop going out for dinner, stop booking hotels, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, we've not really seen that. It's been much more stable than the collapse in consumer confidence would have suggested. So we really care about consumer confidence because it determines if people get that increase in income, how much do they spend and how much do they save? And that could be the difference between kind of growth or recession next year. I just wanted to point out that I think, and I think this echoes kind of what one of the previous presenters said, that actually consumer confidence among those who are more well-off is much stronger than the lower income groups. I mean, you probably could have guessed that, but I think it does show that, the market that you are targeting will be quite different depending on the income of your consumer group. So, economics is quite often called the dismal science, and I don't think we help ourselves with things like this. This is what we call the misery index. And, well, the good news is that consumers should get a lot less miserable, which I said to my colleague and said, is that just economists speak for happier? And yeah, maybe. So basically it says consumer confidence is related to the economic variables which really matter for consumers' lifestyles. So mainly inflation and the unemployment rate. So you can see it's pretty good. That's a pretty good relationship as economic data goes. plugging in our forecasts for inflation and the unemployment rate over the next year or so, consumers should probably get a lot less miserable, hopefully. So that augurs that actually you've got this rise in consumer income. Yes, some of that is going to be offset by increases in mortgage payments, but actually there could be a bit of an increase in spending there. The other thing that I really wanted to talk about is this household savings thing. Because when we talk about risks to the economic outlook, we're always talking about negative risks. This one, I think, is one of these rare positive risks, and that essentially consumers, households, are sitting on a savings pile, an excess savings pile, of about £160 billion. So the difference between what we would have expected had we not had the pandemic and the actual amount of cash in households' accounts, 160 billion. So if consumers do become a lot less miserable or happier, then potentially they start to dip into some of this savings pile. And actually, if I do this chart for the US, that savings pile has shrunk there because consumers there have gone out and spent those savings. And that's one of the reasons why the US economy has been booming. Now, the reason I say this is a risk and is not in the kind of baseline forecast is because most of these savings are held by richer households who do not need to just go out and spend them. They don't even spend the whole income. They don't need to. The other reason is that when we adjust this savings pile for inflation, actually most of it goes away. So remember, inflation's now coming down, but we've had a shock in the price level. The prices of everything is much higher. So you would expect people to just hold more cash in their accounts to account for that. So, not in the main forecast, but it is nice to have an upside risk rather than just being downside the whole time. So we've kind of pointed out that we think consumer spending is going to rise. Some of that will be eaten by higher mortgage payments, but there'll be some left over. There's a lot going on in this chart, so I will just point it out. And the point I'm trying to make with this point is consumer spending patterns have been quite weird over the last year. Spending on goods, so food, clothing, et cetera, has been really weak. Spending on what we call experiences, so things like transport, recreation, culture, hotels, et cetera, has been much stronger. And it's not in here because I got the data too late, but the Q3 data follows this pattern. So again, we've got this kind of weird thing where the things that you would expect consumers to cut back on during a cost of living crisis, they actually haven't. Part of this is probably pent-up demand from the pandemic. So there is a question about, well, how long can this go on for? How much of this is a temporary change and how much is a permanent shift? I don't have a great answer for that. I'm sure there are people in this room who have a far better kind of picture of that. But it is an interesting trend nonetheless. So just finishing up, 2 more slides. This is our forecast for where we see the economy, really. It's really just another year of stagnation, unfortunately. We don't see any significant pickup in growth until the end of next year. End of 2024. That will essentially mean that the UK economy has gone 4 or 5 years with barely any growth. But it does mean that we're not expecting a recession. Now, to be fair, we've got growth of 0.1, 0.2% a quarter. So it wouldn't take much of a deterioration. Perhaps consumers stay miserable for a little bit longer. That would be more than enough to kind of tip us into a recession. So on this slide, I've taken kind of the average forecast of people who do think there's going to be a recession, just to compare it to previous recessions. So if we do have a recession, it's probably going to be pretty small, maybe 1% of GDP. And in comparison to, certainly in comparison to the pandemic or the global financial crisis, it'd be far, far smaller than that. But a lot smaller than kind of what we had in the early 90s or even the 1960s, if anybody remembers that. So really, I think the thing that I want to leave you with is next year is probably going to be pretty tough. Again, another year of stagnation. The outlook gets better towards the end of next year and 2025. Probably avoid a recession. But consumer spending is likely to be a bright spot, or at least a relatively bright spot. And certainly, if the trends continue as they have done, then consumer spending on experiences is likely to probably outperform the economy as a whole as well. So I don't think we've got time for Q&A, actually. But, so I'm very happy if anybody has questions to grab me if you see me around, or just contact me at one of the above things.
Thank you, Thomas Pugh from RSM.